People just get into patterns. They are going kind of like on autopilot and don't even consider being willing to show up in a different way. It's just kind of not even occurring to them. So, but once couples have the willingness, oh my gosh, they can just like once they decide we're going to do this, we're going to be better at conflict, we're going to be better at communication. It's huge in how much it shifts things.
I'm Riley Rees. This is the Sofia Unfiltered podcast where we bring together thought leaders, wellness entrepreneurs, makers, and emerging health leaders. We're here to have raw, unfiltered conversations because sharing your stories has the power to change lives, help others heal, and transform the way we take care of ourselves. Here we go. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sofia Unfiltered, the podcast that dives deep into the real conversations behind your wellness journey. I'm your host, Riley Rees, and today we're talking about something at the core of every lasting relationship: communication. So from daily disconnects to full-blown arguments, how we talk to our partners, especially in long-term relationships, can either build intimacy or create distance. Our guest is Kristen O'Guin, a certified sex and relationship coach who helps couples create emotional safety, connection, and meaningful change in their partnerships. Kristen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Do you want to just jump in and tell all of our listeners a little bit about your background?
Sure. So, yeah, I'm a sexuality and relationship coach. I have a Master of Education in Human Sexuality from Widener University, but I also have a lot of other training and education and knowledge from many different sources and texts and, training in communication, training in the nervous system and trauma. And yeah, I've been working with people in this realm since 2005, although I was also an elementary school teacher for many years, but I always knew I would start working as a coach and supporting people in the realm of sexuality and relationships full time at some point. And so that time came. And so I've been doing it full time for a little over 5 years now.
You went from teaching little babies and toddlers communication now to working with adults in communication.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was doing both at the same time, but yeah, I was primarily focused on the elementary school for many years. So yeah.
Well, great. That sounds good. So I know that communication is huge, right, in any type of relationship, but let's start with the basics. Why does it become harder the longer we're in a relationship?
Mm. Well, it can. It certainly can. It doesn't have to. And there are actually a lot of things that people think get worse or become harder the longer the relationship goes. And it certainly can, but it can get better. Of course, a lot of it getting better is dependent on people wanting to do the work. But I think a huge part of why it can be harder for people to communicate the longer the relationship goes is because of the modern day lifestyle and because of children. When couples have children, they literally just don't have the time and the bandwidth to communicate the way they did before kids and things like that. So the modern day lifestyle is not conducive to the slowing down and the taking the time and the regulated nervous systems and things like that. And then people also just kind of taking it for granted a little bit, not, earlier on in relationships, people will nurture connection and communication a lot more.
You're craving that attention from the other person.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just you've got chemicals in your brain for one thing that are making you prioritize that person, and that's not going to last forever. So,
Absolutely. But now that I sit here and I have you know, the little one and expecting as well. So I just sit here and I'm like, man, but without kids, it would be so much easier. So, but I will not derail this whole conversation to talk about just how hard it is just because you have kids, because I know that just life happens. But with that, though, are there other common patterns or habits that derail healthy communication?
yeah. Well, I mean, for one thing, a huge part of the problem is that all communication, even when you're just meeting someone, in all sorts of relationships, people are are struggling, like, we don't have that sort of, like, education about communication, and so just the lack of skills to be able to express feelings, the lack of skills to be able to talk about, to say difficult things or to hear difficult things. Again, the lack of ability to regulate our nervous systems. There are just so many fundamental things missing that it's easy to just not even have great communication in the beginning, and then yeah, once you're not like primed by those chemicals to like really focus and need each other and such, then yeah, it just gets harder and harder.
Yeah, and I can see this becoming a pattern with family as well, the family dynamics and starting young. You're not taught this anywhere specifically. So I guess you're just pattern matching from what you see from your parents. So I can see a lot of different habits and a lot of different family dynamics playing out, especially when you get into new relationship past that honeymoon phase, how that can change significantly. So it's probably something that you see over and over again.
It is, but really what I see even more is just that the communication was not quite substantial enough from the beginning. I mean, I've worked with, women who are in their 60s or even 70s and just realized they never told their husband what they really needed. They, maybe were resentful so much of the marriage because their husband wasn't showing up for them and they had this realization.
And they just never said anything.
Yeah. And just, all the programming that people get around sexuality can make that aspect of the relationship really, really difficult for people to communicate. And if I could just, help the whole world in being able to communicate about sexuality, like we would just have such a healthier society, a healthier world.
What do you wish every person out there knew?
Well, just, I mean, for one thing, to talk, to communicate. Like there are so many couples who never explicitly communicate. And, a lot of people think, "Oh, it's not sexy to say what I want or what I don't want." But it actually makes for so much better sexual experiences and so much better sexual connection, physical connection to explicitly say those things like, I love it when you kiss my neck, but can you do it a little slower? Or just things like that. Or, I know you love doing that, but I don't really it doesn't really work for me, but I wonder if there's some other way I could support you with that desire or things like that. Just explicitly what we want, what we don't want, what feels good, what doesn't feel good. A huge, huge problem that I see in long-term relationships and just casual dating all across the board is that women and men have gotten programmed with gender roles around sex. I mean, it's intense and it's very very deep. People who are socialized as female have learned messaging like, that sex is for the man, that they have a duty to please their husband and a sense of obligation. And, so many women will allow things to happen to their bodies sexually that they don't really want, that don't feel good, might even be painful because they've just kind of been conditioned to tolerate things that they don't really want. And then there's all this problematic programming that men have gotten around, like a sense of entitlement to women's bodies. In sex education, for example, in school, they always talk about male orgasm because that is required for procreation. But there's never any mention, unless you're extremely lucky, you know, of female orgasm. And just in so many ways, we've just had all these messages that really are keeping women in sexual relationships that are not healthy for them. And a lot of men just don't even realize it. Actually, a lot of men really do want to please their partners and care about their partner's pleasure, but it's just we've all gotten some really bad programming.
Sounds like there's a lot to unpack, even like you mentioned in the education system and just in general in the health system. I feel like the women's health is kind of understudied in general. And now you can see how it's manifested and presented itself later in relationships of all places.
Well, yeah, just, going back to those lack of skills. I mean, when I work with couples on communication, first I get them to like I try to help them foster a sense of being on the same team. And if people can approach issues as like, okay, we both care about each other. Like that's why we're together. And we both want both of our needs to be met, our feelings to be cared about. If they can approach it as a team, like, okay, so you're you're feeling that way, and I don't need to take it as a judgment of me. I can keep the focus on your feelings. Like, it's not about me. It's like, what are your feelings? What are your needs? And yeah, forgetting that they're a team, they did once upon a time know, that's a huge part of it. But also learning how to regulate our nervous systems is just a huge part of what's going on. When what happens, I don't know if you're familiar with what happens when you're triggered into fight or flight mode or freeze.
Hmm. The
So,
sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system. Yep. Yep.
so when the conflict happens, if the sympathetic nervous system is triggered, the blood in the brain starts moving away from the frontal lobe, which is where we have emotional regulation, impulse control, the ability to reason and use logic, things like that. The blood moves away from there and goes to the limbic system, which is all about emotion, and the brainstem, which is all about survival. So people are getting triggered into a state where it's literally harder for them to think. It's harder for them to control emotions or impulses. And the brain is dumping a lot of excess energy, like the adrenals are going off with, adrenaline. And so you're getting all this excess energy, and your body is physiologically primed for fighting or running, or potentially freezing, but which is kind of a combination of the parasympathetic and sympathetic. But anyway, not to get too into the weeds, but basically, you're literally physiologically driven to fight or run.
So you're not
Oh,
gonna get anywhere in that kind of argument, right? Like, it's not a good time to start working things out in that because because you actually cannot think
right.
logically.
It's so much harder to think clearly. Yes. And so, if people can learn how to regulate the nervous system, first you have to recognize, oh, I'm triggered into a fight or flight mode. That can be difficult. The very hardest piece of it can just be noticing, and then, learning those skills and practicing those habits to help move from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic nervous system. Taking a break. Like if you're realizing, oh my gosh, we're just totally bumping heads hardcore right now, stopping, just pausing, not trying to figure it out in that moment, but instead trying to deal with your own emotions and the sensations and the excess energy that you've got in your body, working through that and then coming back later. That can be hugely helpful for people.
Hopefully getting to the bottom of why you were arguing in the first place. But do you see that a lot with couples just having the same argument over and over again?
Yeah, sure, that happens, but what I see even more is just the same patterns. So the content might change, but the pattern of the reactions is consistent. And so, another type of reaction that can happen is just stonewalling, or somebody shutting down. And of course, if you're familiar with like adult attachment styles, the anxious avoidant dynamic can be a recurring pattern.
Explain that for our listeners. Absolutely. Is adult attachment, is that
Adult attachment styles. So, from about the 50s, researchers started looking at attachment styles in babies, how are infants attaching to their mothers and things like that. But the last decade or so, there's been a lot more research into adult attachment styles. And so it's about how we relate to others, and based on a few different types. The main types are anxious, avoidant, and secure. And then there can also be a little bit of other like a combination of anxious and avoidant. But most people, about 50% of the population is secure. About 25% is avoidant, about 20% is anxious, and then the rest are a little bit of a combination. So when someone is anxious, they are afraid of losing love. They are concerned that, the person's going to leave them or stop loving them. They tend to feel like things are their fault, even if they're not. And they kind of have a tendency to just like maybe want to cling a little bit or hold really, really tight. Whereas avoidant people are the opposite. They have a tendency to push intimacy away, to go away, or they get, anxious people are scared of losing love. Avoidant people are can get scared by like too much love or too much attention or too much intimacy or things like that. And so this is a huge thing that affects so many couples where one of them is anxious and one of them is avoidant, and they're playing out these patterns. Like their patterns are totally, their people are unconsciously drawn to each other, who are anxious and avoidant, and they play out these patterns so that, one person is pushing away or running away, the other is kind of clinging, and it's exactly what the other person does not want. So knowing what your style is, can really, really help with communication and with conflict for so many reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see this playing into dynamics. And the third you mentioned as well. So you have avoidant, anxious, and then secure. So how do you see the secure playing out in relationships?
Well, secure is the easiest on everybody. It's the easiest for everybody. Secure is neither like afraid of losing love nor afraid of closeness. Secure folks, they have a lot more peace of mind. It's easiest for anxious and avoidant people to be with secure people because the secure people are not going to get really stressed if the avoidant person is a little less connective. They're not going to take it personally. They're not going to be afraid. They're just going to be like, oh yeah, they're doing their thing. And secure people are so much easier with anxious people because if they do want a little extra reassurance or they do cling a little bit, the secure person isn't going to be freaked out by that. They're going to be like, oh, they love me a lot and it's fine. It's great. So,
All will be fine.
and these can change. So, some people are always going to be anxious, some people are always going to be avoidant, but with different people, it can trigger different styles. So, an anxious person can actually be avoidant if they are to connect with an anxious person, for example, or, if an anxious or avoidant person connects with a secure person, it can actually, kind of trigger them to be secure.
Oh, wow, that's incredible. But talking about conflict and how all of this, now that we understand that there's a lot more to just okay, love languages, we have our attachment styles. How do we use this to fight fair, in these relationships and stop this scorekeeping? Can we use these tools?
For sure. Well, for one thing, just related to attachment styles, if an anxious and avoidant couple can be aware of when they're playing out the pattern and consciously make the choice to act differently instead of replaying the pattern, that's so huge. Because, for example, if an avoidant person is in a conflict with an anxious person, they might just want to get away. They're like, I got to get out of here. And that is going to be an extreme trigger for the anxious person, especially because they're in a conflict. So if the avoidant person can say, hey, I need to take space right now, but I love you. I care about you. I am not leaving you. I'm just going to go and then I'm going to come back after I've cooled down. That can be extremely helpful for the anxious person. And if the anxious person can, just say to themselves, like, okay, they need to take space. That's a good idea, actually, because, it was really heated and some space would actually be good and I'll be okay, self soothing, or just if an anxious person, for example, is needing more reassurance. Because, like, if you're anxious, you need to be with a partner who is willing to give you reassurance. You just do. And so if an anxious person can say, I'm kind of feeling a little insecure, could you give me a little reassurance? And that avoidant person is willing to do that, just, "Oh, yes, you don't need to feel insecure. I love you. I'm here for you." Um, that just that alleviating that sort of tension between the anxious avoidant dynamic can be super helpful for
For any
uh,
couple. Yeah, absolutely.
conflict and just random feelings that may come up and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. What about the defensiveness? What role does defensiveness play in escalating arguments? And how can
Mm,
people shift that more into a curiosity instead of that defensiveness?
yeah. Well, one thing that I love, whether it's defensiveness or all the other factors that can exacerbate conflict, is I teach couples to utilize breathing. It's so powerful and just, to recognize whether it's defensiveness or stonewalling or all the other sorts of stuff. Okay, we're having a conflict and it's going to be worse if we try to do it from this state. So I'll teach them to take some breaths together. And it's also really connective, right? Because they're like, it reminds the nervous system, it reminds their psyche, like, we're in this
And it's
together.
calming down together.
Yes. Sometimes I'll suggest breathing. Other times I would suggest actually you need to do some movement. So go for a walk, go for a run, you know, take the space, do some push-ups or jumping jacks, put some music on.
Some way to exert that energy just as quick as possible, basically.
Yes, exactly.
What other tools besides breathing and movement do you recommend in these? I guess they're just de-escalation, right? Techniques.
Sure. Yeah. One thing that can help to prevent arguments is to have a regular meeting where you just kind of talk about your relationship. So maybe it's once a week or once a month. You literally put it on the calendar, you schedule some time, you talk about things that are always, important to you. For example, maybe you go over your schedule for the coming week. Okay, like, oh, here's my schedule, here's your schedule. Okay. Maybe you talk about how the kids are doing. Let's have a check-in about the kids. Maybe you talk about money, and you have like a set list of things that you talk about, and you especially want to put things on the list that are like high sensation topics. So either high positive sensation or high, negative sensation that you tend to argue a lot about money or something. So you definitely want to put that on a list. So preventing conflicts by having times where you set aside for communication can be super helpful. And then, yeah, like, and then once you're in the conflict, breathing, movement. Also, I like to, some couples, it works really well for them to have some sort of a sign that they can just flash to each other or a word they can say to each other that it's a reminder like, oh, wait, okay, we're getting off into this heated argument.
Not to go off the rails.
Yeah. We don't wanna do that. We actually wanna have a more productive conversation, emotionally safer conversation. So it could be something like, and I'll talk with the couple and they'll come up with it together. But it could be like somebody flashes a peace sign and that's just a reminder and it's a practice. It's like, okay, I'm practicing. Every time I see that peace sign, that means that I pause, I slow down, and we remember that we're on the same team, we want to work together. Or it could be like a particular word or, like a phrase like, remember the practice, or just,
Anything, literally anything.
yeah, something short that one person can do to the other to help because it's about being lucid and conscious. So much of conflicts, people are not lucid because of like fight or flight mode or just feel their emotion.
Wrong part of the brain's activated.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like when the couples can learn to work together and do this and de escalate themselves together, it seems like maybe we're talking about turning conflict into connection, right? So conflict's not always a bad thing, but a lot of couples treat it like it is. This is also a way to be able to open up, get your thoughts out for those people who may not be so open to speaking their minds. And then it can actually bring you closer together and get all of it out. Plus, your scheduled weekly chats seem very helpful as well. And just drawing more connection in, even if it's from conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really rare that you're going to have a long-term relationship without any conflict. And there can even be relationships where it's actually kind of like a bad sign that there's no conflict.
Yeah, I was about to say, it sounds like in your case, when you mentioned some people in their 60s, like never told their partner how they really feel, it's like, that's not good either. You're just always being passive and submissive, and
Totally.
that doesn't sound like a fun way to live
Right,
either.
right. Or it could be that people are numb or people are checked out. It's like, but intimacy, true intimacy tends to include all of the aspects of our humanity. So, and, conflict or anger or, things like that are part of the human experience. And so, yeah, like one thing that I recommend for a lot of couples is the book Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg.
We'll
Ugh,
definitely capture this in the show notes for everybody.
it's so wonderful. There's just to clarify or give a little caveat. It talks about a specific formula for how to communicate, and I don't find the formula to be super important. Like if the formula works for you, great. It can be really helpful to do that formula, but there are so many things that I love about that book and that method. For one thing, it teaches people that it's healthy and okay to have needs. Like everybody has needs. It's okay to have needs. It's healthy for you to recognize your needs and communicate them to others. It talks about, and this is so hugely powerful, listening for the needs and feelings underneath the message. And this is huge. So for example, if one partner gets home from work late and the other partner's like, "You're never here for dinner anymore." You know, that partner coming in has the choice. Okay, I can see that as a criticism of me.
Or that they're
Or
hurt, or that the person's just hurt because you're never showing up.
exactly. And it's like it's when we can learn to hear the needs and feelings beneath the content of the message, that is so helpful for couples. And it's so much more connective that way.
Yeah, absolutely. That does sound transformative. What really needs to be present in a relationship, right, for the conflict to become this growth opportunity? I feel like even listening to what they actually need versus just what they're saying is huge. But what do you need for that growth opportunity versus the constant power struggle?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one thing really is willingness. People just get into patterns. They are going kind of like on autopilot and don't even consider being willing to show up in a different way. It's just kind of not even occurring to them. So, but once couples have the willingness, oh my gosh, they can just like once they decide we're going to do this, we're going to be better at conflict, we're going to be better at communication. It's huge in how much it shifts things.
Yeah, that's huge. Do you have a story, anonymous, of course, where a couple learned to communicate? I mean, you've been doing this for so long, but do you have a really powerful story that we can share with our listeners where it really transformed their relationship?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just, talking about going back to that programming around sexuality and that aspect of the relationship. So for example, a couple came to me who had been together for almost 20 years and she hated sex. She hated the sense of obligation that she felt. And this is so common. This is just such a common story. And a lot of times what I do in those situations is I just say, let's take sex off the table. Let's give it space. She needs space. And that's tends to be more the woman in these situations, although the genders can be reversed as well. And so instead, let's get back to just more no pressure physical intimacy and just connecting with sensuality, touch. I teach couples how to be mindful with touch, which actually hugely changes the quality of touch and experience. And, so I gave him this homework assignment. I want you to just take turns, set the timer for 15 minutes, and one of you lays down, the other just shares mindful touch with that person. One person is giving, the other person is receiving. If you're receiving, your job is to just stay out of your thoughts, just feel the sensations. And if you'd want to make any adjustments, to use your voice. That's part of your job, to use your voice to ask her what you want or adjustments and things like that. And so the woman was just like, she was just cracking up when I'm telling her this. She's like, "This sounds so silly. Like, I can't, blah, blah, blah." And I was like, and there's no sexual touch right now. That's not what you're doing with this. It's really, it's okay if arousal happens, but that's not what this is about. You're not going to go there. And, the first time she tried it, she said tears were just streaming down her face because she had never experienced in their whole 20 years or, any relationships previous to that, she just never experienced that sort of safety and focus on her. And I just want to encourage people to get more support around communication, more support around sexuality, because these are hugely important and impactful aspects of long term relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. If one of our listeners right now is feeling emotionally distant from their partner, like right now, what's the very first step they can take?
Mm. Well, I think they need to first assess, are they feeling emotionally distant because they're withdrawn or distant, or is it because their partner is withdrawn or distant? And the very first thing, it always starts with your own centeredness. So coming into your own, like, you can have the feelings, but doing it from a place where you're calm and you're centered is really, I think, the first step. And then approaching your partner, but it can vary as to, if you've got two secure people and someone's feeling that way, it might be a different first step than if you have an anxious and avoidant couple.
Oh, sorry. So it really depends on that adult attachment style,
Well, that's
on
one,
how you're going to take how you're going to take that first step.
yeah, that's one of the factors. Another factor is if somebody has a pattern of stonewalling or just shutting down, um, sometimes just giving a little bit of space for that emotional distance is what's needed, not trying to connect in that moment. But, honestly, if couples could just have this underlying understanding that you're both on the same team. And if I have a problem or if I'm upset, you don't need to take it personally. We can navigate it together. Like, we can navigate it.
Kristen, thank you so much for bringing so much insight into what it really takes to communicate in these relationships in general, especially the long term relationships and what couples can be doing. If you could share your three fundamental pillars that contribute to your well being.
Diet is a huge thing for me. Um, Diet is so particular to the person. So I don't think there is any particular diet that's the best for everyone, but knowing what diet is best for you. So for example, I don't do a lot of sugar, don't do a lot of wheat. I am very into gut health, things like that. So definitely food as medicine, sort of. I like to have a little bit of what I call recreational food, which is fun. It's not necessarily good for me. I do like to incorporate that. I think that's important too. It's a little bit of like soul food, But for the most part, yeah, like I want to eat in ways that are going to be nourishing and nurturing for my body. Another one is regular movement slash embodiment. So I do a lot of dancing. I'm one of the main facilitators for something called ecstatic dance. I don't know if you've heard that, but it's it started here on the Big Island and has spread all over the world. It's a really powerful practice. But movement of any kind, whatever, just get the heart rate up, break a sweat, and staying connected to the body with that embodiment. And then the other thing for me is like spiritual nourishment and cultivation. And, a lot of that is like meditation, yoga. being in nature, and just, yeah, I'm pretty eclectic as far as my spirituality. So,
No, that's great. Well, if you're listening here and you're ready to stop repeating the same arguments and start feeling more connected, you can always visit sophiahealth.com to find your certified coaches, therapists who specialize in this relationship support. You can also look up Kristen, also on her website, which will be linked in the show notes as well. So thank you, everybody, for tuning into Sophia Unfiltered. Be sure to subscribe, leave us a review, or share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Kristen, thank you so much. Thanks so much for listening. This has been Sophia Unfiltered, a podcast by Sophia Health, the #1 marketplace for health and wellness. Find services, classes, and products from the top health and wellness providers. Book an appointment or join live classes now. I'm your host, Riley Rees. If this episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear about it in the comments section of your favorite podcast provider or with a 5-star rating. Let us know what your biggest takeaway from this episode was, or share it with someone you hope to inspire. Join us again next time for more real conversations, stories, and insights that help empower you with the knowledge and inspiration needed to transform how we care for ourselves.